Welcome to this artist talk with documentary photographer Bob Gore. We're going to be looking at photographs from Bob's show, which is currently on view at the Interchurch Center, No Justice, No Peace, photographs by Bob Gore from the Black Lives Matter protests in NYC 2020. My name is Jennifer Roberts, and I co-curated the show with Bob, and it has been a real joy and a pleasure to work with him. And now you're going to see we will be joining the talk in progress where Bob is beginning to describe to us how he was drawn to the streets and what his experience was like to be out there and taking these pictures. I hope you'll enjoy.
Multiple demonstrations going on at the same time. It was really a demonstration city. And it was very different from other demonstrations I'd participated in. Because first of all, it was the first time that I saw a predominantly white group of protesters supporting a Black cause. Secondly, which was atypical in my experience, most of the marchers and protesters in New York were female. And it's my thinking that some of that momentum that began the day after Donald Trump's inauguration with the Women's March, I think fueled that the number of women who were wanted to be engaged, wanted to hit the streets, and wanted to protest. So all of that was going on, which made for a very, very rich mix. Obviously, news coverage was prolific. News coverage was 24/7. From the first day of the protests, I was drawn to the streets. It was something that I just felt compelled to do, in spite of the circumstances with the pandemic. And frankly, as some put it, let the younger folks do it. But quite honestly, I wasn't willing to pass up this opportunity. Having been engaged with protest over my lifetime, this was one of those must-do situations. And I really thought it was going to pass in a day or two. But it turned out that the marches continued for weeks in New York and maybe still going on in some remnant scale. But there were massive protests. There were so many protests in any given area that oftentimes they would crisscross and collide with one another. There was no real leadership. There was no real daily formula. There was no central meeting locations, although there were areas where gatherings were likely to happen in Brooklyn and in Manhattan. It was all spontaneous, which gave it a real rich feeling to me. Just a couple of thoughts before we get into the photographs in more detail. And by the way, there'll be a chance at the end of this for questions and back and forth between us. I started in protesting as a teenager when Dr. King came to Chicago and started the Chicago Freedom Movement. Even then, I realized that social movements of the sort that we're talking about tonight, and even back then, were oftentimes short-lived. Days, weeks at the most. But unfortunately, those early days didn't provide me with an opportunity to take photographs. Honestly, couldn't afford a Nikon in those days, the cost of film and processing. And I swore to myself, if such an opportunity ever presented itself, I would not miss it. So the photographs we're going to talk about tonight, number, I think, 2022, but they were culled from about 5,000 images I shot over the course of a month. But thanks to Jennifer's keen eye and her sense of not this, not that, or this, not that, you're going to see the best of that whole collection. So now, for now, we can look at some samples. I'll walk you through what was going on, or at least my thinking in the setting, and then we'll come back and a little more commentary from Jennifer and I, and then we'll have some time for questions.
Okay, everyone, I'm going to just take a minute here to set up our slideshow.
You know, one of the aspects of the protests after the George Floyd murder that made them this movement different was that people referred to it as the Black Lives Matter movement, but it really became an umbrella for a variety of progressive causes, organizations, and points of view that had not been expressed in protests before. Clearly, the George Floyd murder was a trigger, but Black Lives Matter became the kind of umbrella that talked about gender equality, the environment, general political progressive politics, and also the murders that had taken place at the hands of police by a variety of African American and other citizens. And so you would see signs and hear chants and see representations from a variety of causes, all under the umbrella of Black Lives Matter.
This photograph looks like it's on 6th Avenue, Bob. I think I can see in the print. So I know you went to a bunch of different locations, right? You, when you went to these marches, you were in a lot of different places in the city, right?
Yes, yes. Actually, the demonstrations found me. I didn't have to go searching very far. But 6th Avenue, for those who know New York, Union Square it has been a gathering spot for young people and musicians and artists for many, many years. And 6th Avenue, which is a broad avenue, was taken over almost daily, multiple times during the day by the protesters. It's a very wide avenue that accommodates thousands. And the vendors, the merchants, and the drivers got used to having life interrupted in that way. Now, keep in mind that before the protests happened, New York was virtually shut down because of the pandemic. So that you went from streets that were, though they were open, they were virtually a ghost town look to them, to massive numbers of people on the street. And yes, 6th Avenue, you can reliably find a march on 6th Avenue every day around noon and every day at sunset. Point of fact, a cousin who has an apartment right on the corner of 6th Avenue and 14th would call me if we hadn't spoken during the day to say, Bob, they're coming, get over here with the camera.
Nice. Built-in invitation alert system.
Yeah. You know, one of the chants that you probably heard earlier in the slideshow and that you probably heard in your own locales from the coverage of the march, if you wanted to march yourself, but they asked the marchers to call their names, and people would call out the names of those who had been murdered at the hands of police. Honestly, when that particular chant, call their name, was spoken, it was all I could do to not break down and cry, because the list was so long of women and men, children, people from abroad who came here. The mix was all inclusive, but just the notion that people were calling out the names of those who had gone on, who may not have had the kind of, well, in fact, none prior to this had the kind of recognition that George Floyd received. Some were only known in local communities. Others, their recognition had come and gone. But this became a time when we were recognizing and memorializing people who had died, and to rekindle the notion that because it happened some months or years ago, we should not give up on seeking justice for these individuals. And so, no justice, no peace was a constant chant. And by the way, no justice, no peace. The twist on that chant, that is the title of the exhibit, was created by Jennifer, and I just thought it was just an appropriate way of realigning the message with words that realign what ought to be our personal assignment. Well done, Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. We have a good rapport. So, and I've been looking at your photographs for a while, so it seemed like a natural fit in that way. Yeah.
It's a great fit. Um, Again, symbolism from the earlier Black Power era, uh, taking the knee, calling out the name, all the ways that people were memorializing, but also recognizing those who came before in the movement and protest for equality and equal justice in America. So along the way, each demonstration I was in took on the kind of aura of the earlier civil rights days through the singing, the quoting of Dr. King, and the playing of his speeches. It was kind of uncanny in talking with people because, and since we're all friends, I'll just tell you a couple of stories. I was typically the oldest person in the mix at the demonstrations. And inevitably, a young person would, by the way, they were very accommodating to the old guy. So inevitably, along the way, someone would ask me, "What do you think of the protests?" And I said, "Gee, I'm really having a great time." And they would ask, "Is this your first?" I'd say, no, I haven't had this a long time. Well, it said, "Well, what was your first?" I said, "Well, it was long before you were born and possibly your parents, even back in the 60s with Dr. King." To which there was kind of this disbelief. I said, "Yeah, it was a long time ago, but I'm really not that old. But yeah, what's happening here today is a reflection of and echoing the messaging, echoing the spirit, and carrying on the fervor that started back in the 60s that is now reflected in all of our social movements in America and around the world through the songs and the cadences and also the words of Dr. King and others." So this recognition and what they express as the continuity of that earlier movement made me feel right at home. It was something that I thought I would never see, let alone participate in. It was revisiting the days and experiences of my youth, which is a great thing to be able to do.
Yeah, I felt there was I wasn't out nearly as much as you were, Bob, but there was a kind of amazing energy in the street when people were marching in these protests. I love this image. And this is at the Barclay Center in Brooklyn, I
Yes,
think, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yes. The Barclay Center, most noted for sports and entertainment events, became the meeting place every day, at least in the late afternoon. And it's a natural gathering spot. It has a large open space, um, good transportation, and that part of Brooklyn is becoming increasingly populated by young people. So that you would have Barclay Center along with Union Square and Times Squares in Manhattan as gathering spots. And sometimes they would crisscross back and forth across the Brooklyn and Manhattan bridges, and the marches would converge. But every evening there would be a gathering in the Barclay Center, and it was reminiscent of the large rallies that many of us have attended over the years. And interesting, there's this kind of communication that took place between the subjects and myself. Uh, the, Most people within eye distance could tell I was taking their picture and were very cooperative, very happy to make sure that I had at least some opportunity for proper framing and to get them the way I wanted to, in a photograph. Again, as you look through these, you'll see that women represented an equal number, if not more than half of the those participating in the protest, which again was new to me because in spite of the fact that most of the protests were peaceful, when you reach the curfew point each day, the police would come out, break up the crowd. It could get rough. There were arrests, and it was perceived that the rough and tumble side was for males only back in the day. Well, that's all changed, and women were right there on the front line all day, taking it, whatever, however it came, and expressing the points of view that in many cases were uniquely female in terms of their genesis. You know, each protest setting was a surprise. You didn't know what was going to happen because it was unplanned, and the crowd really didn't give any indication about what would happen. This was on, again, a late afternoon weekday, and there was a group of marchers at the front of a group of marchers were women in Islamic garb. And I've always liked shooting worship across any all faiths, and particularly outdoors. But I didn't know that this was going to happen, because actually the call to prayer happened, and they started going into prayer right in front of me. I mean, I couldn't have been better positioned for that. Now, that was the only time that I saw any of the protests take on a sectarian or worship mode. I was really glad to get this photograph, because in my other life, photographing worship is a major interest of mine. And this was one of those symbolic settings that we all see represented on television and in films around the subject of Islam, the faith, or politics. But I was so glad to be right in position. As you can see, I was right there. But as I mentioned, the folks in prayer came to me. I didn't seek them out.
I really love the way the gentleman in the front there has the bullhorn, because you feel like, you know, he was leading a chant one minute and then he was down doing his prayers in the next minute. You know, I love that bullhorn in the front there.
Yeah, in this case, that gentleman was the imam, and he led the call to prayer.
Wow.
Because again, maybe some of those gathered in the kneeling position knew what was going to happen, but the rest of us did not. So they wanted to let the crowd know what was going to happen, provide space for those praying, but also to adopt a more respectful kind of presence. The crowd noise ceased, and people observed, but didn't talk over the singing and chanting stopped up to the point where the prayers ended. It was a real polite kind of nature to all of this. You know, I mean, it was, like I said, it was in general, like I said, because people perceive me as being the elder in the mix, you know, they offer me water. How do you feel? Are you okay? You know, it was all kind of cool.
They were looking out for you, Bob. That's sweet.
Yeah.
There we go. There we go.
Yeah. You know, there were many messages, many categories of messages, and many layers of messaging that went on within, you know, the marches, and this is an example of that. And you know, you have how shall I say? This is probably the only occasion in my life where so many different points of view coalesce so peacefully and so seamlessly. There were people from far reaches of the political spectrum coming together. And in other cases, what you would have might be a shouting match that could have evolved into a, you know, pushing match, but everybody was willing to hear the other person's point of view and to share the space together. And as you know, people, particularly in the, well, young people in general in the political spectrum can be very passionate. and sometimes, you know, kind of blindsided about hearing other people's opinions and acknowledging other points of view. Um, but here, the environment, uh, the issue of policing, the issues, I should say, the topics of religion, uh, the issues of race, all came together and were represented in a by and large cordial fashion.
And that looks like the Barclay Center again, right? Correct?
The Barclay Center became, well, actually, and I could blame you, Jennifer, because you like the Barclay Center
I
shots.
know. There's something about those pictures from
Yes.
you're right. I chose quite a few from
Well,
there.
the one thing about the Barclay Center is that this is just true about protests in general. You get better pictures when people are standing still. Okay, you know,
Right.
it makes life easier. But yeah, the Barclay Center, like I said, became the framing for lots of activity. Brooklyn, as everyone knows, is a very diverse borough in the city, large. It's about the size of Chicago in terms of population. And so, and the Barclay Center is like at a crossroads, literally. So it's everybody knew where it was. It's easy to get to, and there was space.
Yeah.
So you have a courtyard leading up to the entrance of the stadium that can accommodate, you know, 8,000-10,000 people. That's a rare open space in New York.
Right.
Yeah. The sign kind of tells the story. It was also important that the folks who did this sign and others recalled deaths that took place back in the civil rights era, not necessarily the hands of police, but the hands of white racists, police. You know, in the South during the civil rights era, yes, there were formal police departments and sheriffs, but when there was political activity in town, the sheriff would deputize white citizens to participate and gave them full police powers. So in the case of one of the names listed, Emmett Till, who was killed in a place called Money, Mississippi, he was there visiting, and what started out as a young guy making a passing remark to a woman cost him his life. He went into a little local store, and when the clerk handed him his change, he said, "Thank you, baby." Well, the word got out, and the law enforcement and deputies went searching for him. He lost his life. His death became a major cause celeb in Chicago because he was greatly brutalized. In fact, you couldn't recognize him, but his mother chose to have an open casket funeral and allowed photography at the funeral, which for the first time described through imagery the horrors of what happens in the South. I think he was 13 or 14 years old. He was a kid. That could happen to anyone if you dared violate local custom. So this listing took us back to earlier years as a reminder that though George Floyd was the cause of the protest, it was not the start of the senseless murders. Well, all Black parents are concerned with this, and the vocabulary of having to talk with your son has entered the mainstream, referring to how you describe or how you prepare a young Black boy for his inevitable interaction with the police. And how do you handle yourself in your conversation in such a way that you don't end up being a victim? The truth of the matter is, there is no textbook for how the conversation should go, and there is no way to avoid bigotry if confronted with it. But this conversation of is my son next is one that every parent of a boy, every parent of a Black boy has repeatedly, and it's been one of those rites of passage. You get your driver's license or you get your library card and you have the talk. Strong symbolism. Again, they made it easy for me in so many instances where the action just came to my camera, and you feel the energy, and you feel the unity, and it really the emotion kind of cuts through you when you're surrounded with people who are so deeply passionate, so deeply expressive around a cause that is not from their personal background necessarily, but they decide they can lend their voice in support of others. It was a moving experience throughout the days when I was out in the street with these young people. I think she did that when she saw me go past with the camera, because I was trying to she did exactly what I was hoping she would do. I think we were on Fifth Avenue near St. Patrick's Cathedral, and she wasn't facing me, and I kind of walked back and forth to see if I could get her attention, because I think that to some extent she knew I wanted her picture, but I also wanted her in front of the police gathered there. And again, most protesters were there to be photographed, and were very cooperative if there was a circumstance where I could get their attention. And I didn't. It wasn't a verbal communication. It was, she knew I had cameras around my neck, what I was attempting to do, and in this and several other photographs, you'll see that I got good cooperation.
Yeah, I love that. Love her.
Yeah, and then some people, aside from being messengers, they're just lovely. They came prepared with the clothing, the signage. It's New York. There's a fashion component to this because you want to stand out. Your whole body becomes a message. Now, not many were as well packaged as this sister, but she was, her whole presentation supported her message, because inside of all of this message of protecting Black women had layers of meaning. Obviously, those women who have been brutalized at the hands of the police is something to draw attention to. But also protecting Black women sometimes from their partners, from others in the neighborhood, to stand up for Black women, because that hasn't been the case, and to sensitize everybody, Black and white, to the plight of Black women inside of this issue of police brutality and police murders. But like I said, she effectively carried the message, and I think I had to do 2 or 3 shots of her until she caught my eye. And once she did, it was like, boom, there it is. I mean, it's poster ready.
Yeah, she looks like she's looking straight at you for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of worked hard. And again, it's nonverbal communication, but you know, she wants to make sure, and by the way, the protesters don't know whether you're from a paper or
Right.
how you're going to publish, but you know, they can tell that you are a photo enthusiast at some level and that you have a plan in mind. And which ironically, there were not that many photographers on the streets. Now, it may have been where I was and what was going on in other parts of the city, because there were never enough photographers in any of the newspapers to cover all the protests that were happening simultaneously in New York City. Uh, and I didn't chase the protests. I was lucky enough just to bump into them. But, you know, in New York City, there's all kinds of outlets for your message. And I think people identify me as one of those people who might be able to help them carry the message. In two instances, I actually had interviews with reporters who wanted to know what I was doing, why I was doing, and then this conversation shifted to earlier protest experience in my life, which became part of their stories. But there simply weren't enough reporters or photographers to cover the many concurrent protests that were happening all around the metropolitan area.
So
Well,
this, you described to me that this is the musician, John
John Baptiste,
Baptiste,
yeah,
right?
yeah. He's yeah. Well, you know, there are how shall I say? You never know what's going to happen. I arrived at the Barclays Center that afternoon, and there was a multicolored piano sitting in the open space by itself. Now, I didn't know whether it was there from an earlier musician. I didn't know if it was there just for someone to sit down and tinker with, or something else was going to happen. But there really weren't any people in the Barclay Plaza at that time. So I waited maybe 15, 20 minutes, at most a half hour. Jean Baptiste comes, and he had his whole band with him. And you can see from the interest of the photographers, many had been following him, and he gave a concert for the better part of an hour.
Wow.
But the whole purpose to his presence there was voter registration. And you didn't know this when he started playing, but he certainly was obviously a crowd draw. Now, I didn't have to seek him out. I was standing in the plaza by myself. And he came, you know, within 5 feet of me,
Hmm.
and he played variety of instruments and on that multicolored piano. And he kind of knew me or remembered me from earlier performances that he had been a part of that I photographed. But he did what I wish we saw more of, which is, now you're out here having a good time and sharing with your friends. It's a lovely day, and you're expressing your outrage about society's ills. But now what? What are you going to do? And he and his crew set up voter registration tables and actually registered people right then and there, right after his hour-long concert.
That's great.
It, kind of making it real, but by making it tangible. Plus, he's a great guy. I mean, the guy's a wonderful personality. He loved the crowd. The crowd loves him. And
Mhm.
some of the photographs were all over the media the next day. You know, all kinds of people joined the protest. The lady in the center, Lori Cumbo, is a majority leader in the New York City Council. And she was there really interrogating the ranking police officer. Now, I didn't really see her at first. I was just shooting the interaction between the policeman and the other members of the circle. But I noticed he was spending a lot of quality time with this group. Then when I saw her, it all became clear. And as to why he was, well, first of all, there at all having the conversation, because officers of his rank would normally, those in command wouldn't necessarily be in the crowd, but they would be guiding, you know, officers to respond to the crowd. But the other thing about Lori Combo is that she's really an artist at heart. And she's, before she went to the city council, she she ran a major arts center in downtown Brooklyn, in fact, right around the corner from the Barclays Center. And she's been very supportive of activists and activist activities. And she's a great fan of my son. And so on Facebook, I think she believes I'm him sometimes, the way she writes back. Such, wonderful messages. But, you take a compliment however you can get it, right?
Sure. Yeah, this is I love this image too. I love the whole composition of it.
She's a great lady. Yeah. This, these were the kind of signs. This kind of message is a message of the modern movement, where whites aren't just sympathizing with Black causes, they're really showing up in numbers and protesting and offering support beyond the fact that I feel your pain. And this whole notion of, I can never walk in your shoes, but I don't necessarily have to be a supporter of you. And that's an important kind of conversation to have, because it's a conversation that's evolved over the years from the early civil rights days, where you had people who were sympathetic, but really weren't engaged in a cause that was meaningfully supportive of yours. And sometimes the support you give to my cause is to go and organize in your community, to go and organize in your workplace, and to deal with those issues that affect me as only you can in your community, that greatly impact me. And so the young people repeatedly displayed their sophistication and what seemed like commitment that went beyond, this is what I'm doing this afternoon, and I go back to my regular life. I mean, there's some thought that went in these messages, and I don't think you can do a sign like that and not have some rub off in your life in the following days. Mm. Well, speaking of, are you here to take my picture? This was, it was, look, I think I took maybe 2 or 3. Actually, lowered at one point. She lowered her mask too, and said, "Okay, look, I want you to see my face," which was the only person who did that in the course of. I ran into the course of shooting throughout the week, but this was I think this is Union Square in Manhattan, and again, the power in her stance. And the power in her whole makeup and her look. She was a walking protest message. And really just said, look, take your time, get one good picture before you leave. And she gave it to me, and there it is.
It's great. I love this, the kids at protests, to me is always a fun, kind of amazing thing.
Take your daughter to work, right?
Right.
I mean, look, if you don't start them here, social media and their friends at school may very well guide them in the direction that you won't be happy with. Mm-hmm. But I particularly like to see, the fathers bringing their daughters. She'll remember this all of her life. And she will talk about it at school. She'll write about it at school. She'll tell her friends. How do I know? Because my boys had the same experience. And, kids can be very forceful. Why weren't you at the march? Your parents didn't take you, and so on and so forth. Because seeing your parents stand up, for what's right, becomes the role modeling that points to you. Well, this is more than what he said. This is what my father does. Okay. And as we all know, children mimic what you do and not necessarily listen to what you say. But they see you doing this, it leaves an indelible imprint on not only what your parents did, but what that cause was all about. And then again, kids know where your camera is even when the adults don't, right?
Right. This was great. Wow.
Well, obviously, some shots you have to construct, right? You know,
That's
but the only
amazing.
pair of big glasses in the plaza, and she was very patient because I had to fix it so I wasn't in the shot and try to get it. You know, it was a little project, but I think she knew what I was trying to do because we never really talked. But it's one of those opportunities that a photographer looks for, but you don't always find. So it was nice. It was nice.
I love that reflection. It's just so
Yeah.
beautiful, Bob. I really love this. Is one of my favorite images, I think.
Well, those glasses were made for a photograph, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Great slide.
Yeah. Yeah. It again, those that universal messaging um, that speaks to the commonality, you know, that we share. And again, what's amazing is the diversity of messages that people carried on their placards and on their shirts and their clothing. It's amazing how diverse and creative the signage was.
Yeah.
Uh, and quite frankly, this is just again a small sample of how people represented the cause throughout the weeks of the protests in New York City. There were their cars, there were their clothing, there were their bicycles, there were their windows, there were the trees in front of their homes. Every area was used to post a message and to make an individual statement reflecting their commitment.
Yeah, I feel like from going through a bunch of your images too, Bob, we almost could have had a show that was just a selection of signs of people with their signs, like an array of, which we have a
Absolutely.
little bit here, but you could have just focused on the signs too.
Well,
Uh,
you could have done one just on the cyclists and their
yeah,
signage. The cyclists were a big component of this,
yeah,
and of course they had their bodies and their bikes. So you know what's painted across your back, what's painted across your chest, the
yeah,
signs and the
yeah.
lights. And you know it was, and yet it's New York City too. You know, people are looking to be individualistic, all while they're engaged in mass protest.
Sure, sure. I think that is our last image.
Ah,
We've
um, let me just say at the end of this, while this slide is up, this is
yeah,
part of this exhibit is part of a bigger celebration that's happening at the Interchurch Center in New York City on Columbia's campus. And the Interchurch Center, for those who don't know, is probably a singularly unique location for nonprofit organizations, educational organizations, and religious organizations. Under one roof, there are probably some 70 denominations and faith related organizations across a wide range of faiths, all living under one roof and collaborating and sharing together. Um, and the Interchurch Center was built, just shy of 60 years ago by the Rockefellers as a way of bringing together um, organizations that have a similar purpose, but otherwise might not be in touch because of where they were located. The lady who heads the organization, Paula Mayo, the president and executive director, is really the spark plug behind this exhibit, the concerts that happen there, but more importantly, the fellowship that happens under the roof. So if you're ever in New York, they also have a great cafeteria there too. So it's a great place to visit.
it's a really nice place to stop. I know
Yeah.
when I started working there, I thought to myself, how did I not know about this place before? Like I was kind of amazed.
Well, ironically, when I was a community organizer back in the day, the organization that funded our activities in Chicago was based at the Interchurch Center, which is called euphemistically the God Box.
Right, that's right. And this is information about you, Bob. So this is a way people can connect with you. Bob has Instagram and Facebook, and maybe now we could talk a little bit about the fact that you're making these pictures available to people for download, right? Do you want to talk a little about that?
Thanks for that. That Smug Mug link there. In fact, you can go to Bob Gore Smug Mug, and what I'm doing is my target audience for all of this is really kids. And so my hope is that by giving away the photographs to parents, teachers, and everybody, it will stimulate discussion about protest and maybe even help them contextualize what happened in the summer versus the protest that happened at the Capitol last week. Now, by the way, this isn't an original idea of mine because the news organizations have been doing juxtaposition of the photographs from last summer with the events at the Capitol a week ago Wednesday. And it occurred to me that if children had access to photographs from the protests, it would stimulate discussion, creativity, and let them, just work with it as kids can do. So if you go into my Smug Mug site, and by the way, if you don't worry about writing this down, everybody who received an email will be on the list for the instructions on downloading later next week. And again, the hope is we'll get this to those working with children at home and in the classroom as a way of stimulating their minds around the topic of social involvement.
That's great, Bob. Love it. I'm just going to I need to backtrack to just see if we had any questions. If anyone has any questions for Bob, if you type them into the chat box there, we can take a couple minutes, but if not, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time, Bob. This has really been wonderful. I love talking to you anyhow, but I love talking about your work with you.
Well, but this is, it doesn't get any better. I mean, again, revisiting the great times you had in your youth, in this case, the protests from 2020 took me back to what I was doing as a teenager in Chicago. So it was really, it was a joy to see and to feel the enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I thought that one of the conversations we had, something that stuck with me is where you were kind of describing how you had the sense of these current marches having a feeling of like consciousness raising.
Yeah.
Whereas when you were participating in the civil rights marches, they were often attached to very specific legislation or very, and they were smaller. But that's a very interesting point to me. That's a really, yeah.
Well, protests in 20,000 cities, 200 outside the US, go figure.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been political events in Europe where they would use "We Shall Overcome" as kind of theme, but there were protests in towns under the Black Lives Matter banner where there are no Black people.
Yes, yeah, absolutely true.
Now that was a very definite new way of thinking about the movement, but it also said that it wasn't necessary to have Black people next to you to say Black Lives Matter, right, which is really the way you want the conversation to migrate. Okay.
There we go.
So can you see these messages I'm seeing on my phone?
Yes, I can. I can, Bob. Yeah, very nice.
Cool. All right, thanks.
Nice messages from people here. It's great. I guess If there are no other questions, I guess we can sign off.
And thank you all.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. And don't be shy about connecting. You have the social media information. You can find me easily on Facebook, so feel free to do that. It's Jennifer Roberts. And yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, and thank you all for your warm thoughts. Thank you for being here. Again, I want to make sure that I reach out to all of you all with the link to download the photographs. Again, the online site is called Smug Mug. You can go to Google and go Smug Mug Bob Gore, and you'll get there. But if you received an email, I'll make sure you get the link and to share it as widely as you can.
It's great.
Thanks so much, y'all.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.